Did you know that the Byzantine Empire under Justinian tried to bring Roman rule back to Hispania? I'm David Cott, host of New History of Spain, and in episode 15 of the chronological series, I will explain the civil war between Agila and Thanagild for the Visigothic throne, the conquest and creation of Byzantine Spania, why the attempt to restore the Roman Empire in the West failed, and the key elements of Visigothic society in Iberia. Justinian and the Renovatio Imperii. In the last episode, The Darkest Days of Visigothic Rule in Iberia, I covered the first half of the 6th century, a challenging but pivotal time for the Visigothic kingdom. This was when the Visigoths shifted their base from southern Gaul to Hispania. During this period, major geopolitical changes took place that also affected the Visigoths. This time, it wasn't the barbarians driving the changes, but the Roman Empire, specifically the eastern part that survived, what we call the Byzantine Empire. When Justinian came to power in 527, the Mediterranean Sea was no longer under Roman control. Rome itself wasn't even ruled by the empire that still called itself Roman, as the capital had moved to Constantinople. The western part of the Roman Empire had been under barbarian kingdoms for decades, and Justinian found this unacceptable. Unlike his predecessors, he aimed to fully restore the Roman Empire with both an ideological and military plan known as the Renovatio Imperii. From that point on, barbarian kings could no longer claim to be the legitimate rulers acting on behalf of the Roman Empire. At the time, the barbarian kingdoms in the West could have been seen as temporary compared to Rome's long history, so the idea of a Roman reconquest didn't seem impossible. Some historians suggest that Justinian's Renovatio Imperii was a way to distract his citizens from internal issues and unite them against a common enemy. Some even deny the existence of a well-thought-out plan. However, it would be wrong to underestimate the importance of ideology in driving these conquests, especially the desire to restore religious and political unity under one universal Christian empire. This same idea of a universal Christian monarchy would later inspire Charles V, although, like Justinian's efforts, his too will eventually fail. But going back to Justinian's time, we need to understand that the religious motivation was just as strong as the political one. Like other Byzantine emperors, Justinian sought supreme control over both secular and religious matters. This is known as Caesaropapism, a blending of church and state power. Naturally, many bishops oppose this interference, but it's crucial for understanding the idea of unity behind Justinian's actions. Justinian's predecessors had already strengthened the administration, military, and economy, providing a solid foundation for his imperial restoration. Justinian opportunistically took advantage of internal dynastic conflicts to conquer the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in 534, which included Ceuta and the Balearic Islands. His next target was Italy, ruled by the Ostrogoths. The Gothic War could have ended as quickly as the Vandal campaign, but a series of poor decisions led to a prolonged conflict that devastated Italy. At the same time, Justinian's empire was fighting on multiple fronts, in Italy, North Africa, and against the Persians in the east. To make matters worse, the plague of Justinian spread across the Mediterranean, something I covered in the previous episode, so check it out if you missed it, and please subscribe to the show on YouTube or podcast. Meanwhile, the Frankish kingdoms were gaining strength by conquering Burgundy and taking Provence from the Ostrogoths. The Ostrogothic king fought back, reclaiming land and executing Roman senators. Ironically, the Roman order that had survived under rulers like Odoacer and Theodoric the Great was now being destroyed in reaction to Justinian's attempts to restore the Roman Empire in the West. Agila and the Visigothic Civil War. All of these significant events occurred during the reign of King Theudes. He was already deeply concerned about Justinian's Renovatio Imperii after the conquest of Italy and North Africa, knowing that the Visigothic kingdom in Hispania might be next. By then, the Visigoths no longer had their Ostrogothic cousins to protect them. Theudes tried to take Ceuta from the Eastern Romans, as it posed a constant threat. But his expedition ended in a resounding failure. After his death and the brief reign of his successor, the Visigoths faced over 2 decades of crisis and territorial losses in Spania. From this point onward, I will use the term Spania instead of Hispania because that's what it was starting to be called, and how it was referred to during the Middle Ages. However, in the Visigothic period, Spania was a fluid concept. For instance, King Leovigild considered himself king of Spania, Gallicia, and Narbonensis. Due to the former presence of the Suebi, Gallicia was considered separate, a fact I covered in a YouTube episode where I gave a complete overview of the kingdom of the Suebi. To avoid confusion between the Iberian Peninsula as a whole and the Byzantine province of Spania, I will specify when referring to Byzantine Spania. With that cleared up, after King Theodosius' assassination in 548, the Visigothic magnate Agila was chosen as king. The Visigoths had been trying to expand their control in the southern province of Baetica, but with little success. Most records show that the rule was largely confined to Seville. Córdoba resisted Visigothic control, and its elites wanted to remain independent. According to later sources, the Arian Christian Agila desecrated the church of Córdoba's patron saint, sparking a popular revolt. The people of Córdoba attacked Agila and his army, and surprisingly defeated the Goths, killed Agila's son, and seized part of the royal treasury. This was a severe blow to the economy, prestige, and identity of the Visigoths. Agila was forced to retreat to Merida, and this humiliating defeat undermined his authority and legitimacy. A faction of the Visigothic aristocracy, led by Athanagild, rebelled against Agila from Seville. This marked the beginning of a Visigothic civil war. And who was an expert at exploiting civil wars? That's right, Justinian. The Byzantine conquest of Spania. Athanagild didn't think he had enough support to defeat Agila on his own, so he sought help from Justinian's Byzantine Empire. Justinian was busy with more important fronts, like his final campaigns against the Ostrogoths, but he was able to send a small force to Spania. He still remembered how he had failed to respond to the Gothic attack on Ceuta in 546. Although we don't know the exact details, Athanagild and Justinian made a deal. Perhaps Athanagild offered Justinian control over part of Spania, which would fit into Justinian's plans to restore the Roman Empire. In mid-552, a force of around 2,000 Byzantine soldiers, led by an 80-year-old senator named Liberius, likely landed near Algeciras. Liberius had served as a high-ranking official under Theodoric the Great in Italy and Gaul, and later as a governor in Egypt for the Byzantine Empire. This was his final mission just before his death. The Byzantine intervention proved that Theudis had been right to try to take Ceuta, because even though we have very few details about this campaign, it's logical to assume that naval support from the Ceuta garrison was crucial. We know that a battle took place near Seville between Agila's supporters and Athanagild's rebels, and the rebels won. For the next 2 or 3 years, the Byzantines seemed to focus more on securing their hold on the southern coast of Spania than on directly helping Athanagild. But during this time, Justinian's empire also managed to conquer almost all of the Ostrogothic kingdom and fend off invasions from the Franks and Alemanni, freeing up more troops to send to Spania. In 554 or 555, a larger Byzantine force landed in Carthago Spartaria, present-day Cartagena. Realizing what was coming and not wanting to suffer the same fate as the Ostrogoths, Agila's supporters assassinated him in Merida, thus ending the Visigothic civil war. Athanagild now had the task of restoring Gothic authority and fighting his former Byzantine allies to prevent a full-scale invasion. However, the Byzantines only managed to hold on to territory along the southern coast, from Cadiz to Denia, and Athanagild couldn't drive them out. Historians have debated extensively about Justinian's motives and goals in intervening in the Visigothic civil war, especially since sources show little interest in the province of Spania and the resources allocated to it were minimal. Some believe Byzantine Spania had a geostrategic purpose: to prevent Visigothic attacks on Byzantine-controlled North Africa. This idea is supported by the fact that the Byzantines only occupied coastal areas, had previously taken Ceuta, and that the Duke of Spania reported to the governor of Byzantine Africa. However, this theory seems weak, as the Visigothic kingdom was still recovering from the defeat at Bulle, and didn't control all the Iberian Peninsula. In other words, the Visigoths, weakened as they were unlikely to attack Byzantine Africa. The attempt to conquer Ceuta was a separate case, as it just across the strait. But the Visigoths couldn't realistically think of attacking Byzantine holdings in modern-day Algeria or Tunisia. Other historians suggest that Justinian's goal was to reclaim control of Mediterranean trade routes and the Strait of Gibraltar, which made it easier to dominate Atlantic trade. This commercial motivation seems more plausible as a partial explanation, though in the end, Justinian likely wanted to conquer all of Spania, as he had done in Italy and North Africa. If he couldn't do so, it was due to plagues and economic and military difficulties. Therefore, the idea of the Renovatio Imperii guided Byzantine actions in Spania. However, since the empire was already stretched thin, they adopted a more defensive strategy, focusing on protecting the coastal cities they had taken. In the grand scheme of things, the province of Spania was of minor importance to Constantinople. The Byzantine province of Spania. In the end, it seems Justinian and Athanagild had to sign a treaty that set the rough borders of the new Byzantine province of Spania. It stretched from Cadiz to Denia, with inland borders reaching places like Medina Sidonia, Ronda, Antequera, and Baza. The Byzantine administration didn't make many changes, since there were few resources available for large public works, or minting coins in Spania. By the time they entered Spania, the Byzantine Empire was already short on resources for its western campaigns, and most of the emperors who followed Justinian focused on defending the eastern frontiers, paying little attention to the west. Byzantine Spania was governed by military leaders, who were in charge of both administration and defense, while bishops held civil power in cities, a role once held by local councils. Although Malaga and Ceuta have been suggested as potential capitals, Cartagena was most likely the administrative center. It had better connections to the Mediterranean and had previously been the capital of the Roman province of Carthaginensis, as well as having a metropolitan episcopal see. The Visigoths benefited from this by stripping Cartagena of its status as the main bishopric for certain dioceses under their control. At its peak, there were about 5,000 Byzantine soldiers in Spania, mostly stationed in coastal cities. However, as the territory shrank and the empire faced bigger challenges elsewhere, this number dwindled. The Byzantines had other major threats to deal with, like the Berbers in North Africa, the Lombards invading Italy, the Avars and Slavs in the Balkans, and the Persians in the east. Unsurprisingly, the small and peripheral province of Spania was far from a priority. There were also few settlers, so Greek cultural influence was minimal. In fact, we see more Eastern influence in Visigothic Merida, where a Greek doctor and an Egyptian became bishops. The borders of Byzantine Spania were never stable, similar to the borders in Vandal and Byzantine North Africa, which were threatened by the Berbers. Between the Visigothic kingdom and the Byzantine province, there were autonomous cities and regions acting as buffer zones, such as Córdoba and the mountain ranges of Jaén and Albacete. This situation lasted until Leovigild started his campaigns of conquest throughout Spania. Although the conflict between the Byzantines and the Visigoths flared up at times, the borders were open, allowing people and goods to move freely. One of the leading experts on Byzantine Spania, Jaime Vizcaíno Sánchez, offers an interesting reflection after analyzing archaeological remains from across Byzantine Spania. He notes that the territories occupied by the Eastern Romans in Spania underwent fewer changes than those in the Visigothic kingdom. This makes perfect sense because the Byzantine presence was modest and the goal of the Renovatio Imperii was to ensure the continuity of Romanity. For example, the trade and cultural ties between Spania and North Africa grew stronger under the Byzantines, as shown by the ceramics and coins from Africa, while Eastern Roman coins were rare. Within this system, Ceuta and the Balearic Islands were also under Byzantine control. They were integrated into the empire's administrative, tax, and military systems, maintaining an economic and commercial activity similar to previous centuries. The Byzantines played a key role in keeping Mediterranean trade alive, even though it had declined significantly since the 5th century. As cities in Byzantine Spania fell to the Visigoths, they became less connected to the Mediterranean trade, a trend that continued throughout Visigothic Iberia and in much of non-Byzantine Europe. As cities in Byzantine Spania fell to the Visigoths, they became less connected to Mediterranean trade, a trend that continued throughout Visigothic Iberia and in much of non-Byzantine Europe. Christian Europe was gradually shifting toward the fragmented reality of the early Middle Ages. Why did the Renovatio Imperii fail? To understand this period, we need to answer two key questions. First, why did some barbarian kingdoms collapse so quickly, even though Romans actively participated in them? And second, why did Justinian's Renovatio Imperii fail? In other words, why couldn't the Byzantine Empire hold on to the lands it reconquered? And why couldn't its expansion mirror the success of the Roman Republic and early Roman Empire? One major reason for the downfall of kingdoms like the Vandals and Ostrogoths was poor leadership. The Ostrogoths had several chances to decisively defeat the Byzantines, but failed, and disputes over succession continued after Theodoric the Great's death. The Vandals in North Africa had also shown weakness for some time, struggling even against local Berber leaders. Additionally, the Vandals alienated many Romans in North Africa with land seizures and anti-Catholic persecutions, so many of them preferred being ruled by the Byzantines or even the Berbers. In the end, military defeat was the main reason for the fall of a barbarian kingdom. We saw this with the Suebi, and the same thing happened to the Burgundians and Thuringians, who were absorbed into the Frankish kingdom. The Visigothic kingdom was nearly destroyed after the Battle of Bouillé, and it wasn't until Leovigil's reign, many years later, that the Visigoths managed to build a stronger kingdom. As for Justinian's long-term failure to fully restore the Roman Empire, several factors beyond military defeats need to be considered. The plague of Justinian significantly reduced the population, which had a devastating effect on both troop morale and the economy. The Byzantine Empire had overextended itself across multiple fronts, but the problem wasn't just having several fronts. After all, the Roman Republic and early Empire also fought on many fronts. The issue was the nature of their enemies. Ancient Rome often fought smaller states and chiefdoms, which made them easier to defeat. But the nature of the barbarian enemies in the 6th century was very different. The Ostrogothic, Vandal, Frankish, and Visigothic kingdoms were post-Roman states that inherited all the Roman infrastructure and administration. They weren't small, weak chiefdoms like the ones Rome had faced before the 5th century. Another key difference was in the role of the armies. The Roman Republic and early Empire integrated conquered peoples into their armies, while the Byzantine army relied heavily on mercenaries, who often returned home when the war ended. This explains why the empire struggled to defend Italy from the Lombards in 568, just 3 years after Justinian's death. There are other reasons the Byzantine Empire couldn't match the success of earlier Rome. For example, the economies of the barbarian kingdoms were more local and self-sufficient. Trade wasn't as widespread, so Byzantine goods didn't reach far into the interior, and they didn't play the political role that ancient Roman goods once held. Ideologically, the key issue was that Rome was no longer the only source of political legitimacy. In the 4th century, the Roman Empire had full control over what was considered legitimate power, even in barbarian territories where Rome could favor certain leaders and use divide and conquer strategies. But by the 6th century, this wasn't true anymore. No single power was strong enough to define who had the right to rule. In Italy, people could support the Ostrogoths, Lombards, or Byzantines, or even turn to the Pope for legitimacy. In Spania, the political situation was so fragmented that in addition to the Visigothic and Suebi kingdoms, there were Byzantine-held territories, independent peasant communities, and local powers fighting to remain politically autonomous. Western Romans generally disliked the Eastern Roman Empire because it was more centralized than the barbarian kingdoms. They had experienced a level of political autonomy and lower taxes and didn't want to give that up. Merchants did want to restore the Roman Empire to bring back peace and trade, but landowners and most of the population weren't interested because it would mean higher taxes. In fact, when the Byzantines took Cartagena, the brothers Leander and Isidore of Seville moved to the Visigothic kingdom, calling the Byzantines barbarian foreigners because they didn't see them as fellow Romans. In this post-Roman world, people like Leander and Isidore of Seville identified more as Hispanians than as Romans. This doesn't mean Justinian's dream of restoring the Roman Empire to its former glory was impossible. As we have seen, barbarian kingdoms could collapse overnight after a major defeat. However, for Justinian to fully succeed, he would have had to conquer all the post-Roman barbarian kingdoms. Only by doing so could he eliminate rival sources of political legitimacy and bring the West back under the united Roman Empire, as it had been before the 5th century. This would have been the only way to align the interests of local and regional elites with those of the central state. The conversion of the Suebi to Catholicism. Before discussing the reign of Athanagild, I want to talk about what was happening in the often overlooked kingdom of the Suebi. As we saw in episode 13 how Majorian almost saved the Roman Empire, King Remisman reunited the Suebi with the help of the Visigothic king Theodoric II. However, after Theodoric's death, the Suebi broke away from being a temporary vassal of the Visigoths and reconstituted their kingdom in the northwest of Spania, in what is now Galicia and northern Portugal. From 469 to the mid-6th century, we know very little about the kingdom of the Suebi, but after that, we have more information about what happened. One interesting event was the arrival of Breton immigrants in Galicia and Asturias. These Britons originally came from the British Isles, but as the Anglo-Saxons arrived and the Scots applied pressure from the north, many Britons settled in Armorica, the northwestern tip of France. Some came directly from Britain, while others came from Armorica to the Suebi kingdom, settling between the Eo and Ferrol rivers and establishing their own bishopric. Their unique ethnic identity allowed them to set up their own church structure, and their bishop oversaw all the Britons in the kingdom of the Suebi, rather than being limited to a specific territory. In 538, Pope Vigilius sent a letter to Profuturus, the Metropolitan Bishop of Braga, expressing concern. He worried that the Suebi's Arian beliefs might confuse Roman Catholics and that the Christian heresy of Priscillianism was still active in Galicia. But what stands out more about the Suebi before their conquest by Leovigild is their conversion to Catholicism. A missionary from Pannonia, modern-day Western Hungary, named Martin, arrived in the Suebi kingdom in the 550s, possibly through diplomatic contacts between the Suebi and the Byzantines. Soon known as Martin of Braga, he founded the monastery of Dumio, wrote many books, and engaged in missionary activity to counter heretical and pagan practices among the Romans and the Suebi in Galicia. This is where we find conflicting accounts of the Suebi's conversion to Catholicism. According to Gregory of Tours, the son of King Cheraric of the Suebi had leprosy. Cheraric heard about the miracles of Martin of Tours, sought to obtain his relics, and promised to convert to Catholicism if his son was healed. Surprise, surprise, his son was cured, and as the story goes, Cheraric and all the Suebi converted to Catholic Christianity. However, Isidore of Seville provides a more credible version, stating that the Suebi converted to Catholicism before 561, under King Theodemir, with the help of Martin of Braga. Theodemir reorganized the church in Galicia, setting up new bishoprics and pulling some dioceses under Suebi control away from the authority of Merida, which was under the Visigoths. These moves were steps toward creating a national church for the kingdom of the Suebi. As will happen later with the Visigothic conversion under Recared, the Suebi's conversion helped strengthen ties between the monarchy and Catholic bishops, as well as the local population. It also helped to gain favor with the Byzantines and Franks, in order to keep the Visigoths weak. It seems that the Arian clergy was absorbed into the Catholic Church to avoid conflicts among Suebic bishops. For example, only one participant at the 561 Council of Braga had a Germanic name, but by 572, 5 of the 12 attendees had Germanic names. The founding of the Visigothic Kingdom of Toledo. Apart from the civil war and conflict with the Byzantines, little is known about the reign of Athanagild. His royal treasury was depleted after Agila lost part of it in Córdoba, and because of the limited Visigothic control over much of the Iberian Peninsula. Despite these challenges, Athanagild had some successes. He reasserted Visigothic power in Seville and strengthened foreign alliances, marrying 2 of his daughters to Merovingian Frankish kings to maintain peace and defend each other against Byzantine threats. We don't know exactly when it happened, but it was under Athanagild that the Visigothic kingdom established its capital in Toledo. After losing Toulouse, Visigothic kings moved from city to city depending on the situation, along with their main sources of power, the army and the treasury. Kings had been based in Narbonne, Barcelona, Mérida and Seville, but Athanagild finally settled the royal court in Toledo. While Toledo wasn't a major city, historians speculate it was chosen for several reasons. One key reason was its strategic location. Toledo had strong defenses, natural resources, and was positioned between Spania's 2 main wealth centers, the Ebro Valley and Bética, along with Mérida. Like modern Madrid, Toledo's location in the interior made it less vulnerable to external attacks from both the north and the south. Additionally, unlike cities like Mérida or Seville, Toledo lacked a powerful Hispano-Roman oligarchy, which allowed the Visigoths to take control without facing resistance or needing to share their power. Athanagild was one of the few Visigothic kings to die of natural causes rather than being assassinated. After his death in 567, there was a 5-month interregnum, indicating that the Gothic magnates were divided and struggled to agree on a new king. With the Visigothic kingdom already weakened, the Goths wanted to avoid another civil war that could lead to their downfall. They eventually chose Liuba, the Duke of Septimania, who was far removed from the court's disputes. But we'll talk more about him and, more importantly, his brother Leovigild in the next episode. Visigothic society in Iberia. Now let's explore the society of the Visigothic Kingdom of Toledo and how it was structured. First, let's start with demographics and ethnicity. The Visigoths were a group of warriors who, accompanied by their families, settled in Spania and became part of the ruling class. About 70,000 to 100,000 Goths settled in the Iberian Peninsula, ruling over a much larger population of 4 to 6 million people, making them a privileged minority. However, this privilege wasn't based on ethnicity but on socioeconomic status. Visigothic society wasn't divided by race. It was based on whether someone was part of the nobility or if they held a public or church office. For example, the ban on mixed marriages, which wasn't lifted until Leovigild's time, wasn't about ethnicity but about keeping the Goths' military privileges intact. If they married someone of a different legal status, it created legal issues for their descendants, and this wasn't resolved for decades after mixed marriages had already started. Over time, being a Visigoth became a symbol of nobility, though most of their original Germanic culture disappeared as they became Romanized. The Visigothic kingdom wasn't just made up of Hispano-Romans and Goths. It also included Gallo-Romans, Suebi, Africans, Greeks, Syrians, Britons, and some Vascons. Spania in the 6th and 7th centuries was far from homogeneous, not just in ethnicity and culture, but also in religion. The population included Catholics, Arians, Priscillianists, pagans, and Jews, and ruling over a diverse population always brings challenges. Visigothic society followed trends from late antiquity and the post-Roman world. This included the decline of cities, reduced trade, growing inequality, and the spread of Christianity. New trends also emerged, like the end of Roman villas and the rise of medieval villages and farms. So, how was Visigothic society organized? As we discussed in episode 9, Late Roman Empire and Christianization of Hispania, the basic social divide was between honestiores and humiliores, the former being the wealthiest and most powerful. There was also a separation between free and non-free people. In Visigothic times, they began to use terms like mayores, señores, and senatores to indicate high rank, as opposed to inferiores, minores, or viles, were free people not in the circles of power. The upper classes included goths, who became landowners, public officials, bishops, and other high-ranking clergy. These privileged groups had legal advantages, such as their work carrying more weight in court and receiving lighter punishments. Next were the free people who didn't have legal privileges and weren't generally among the wealthiest. This group included small and medium landowners, business owners, merchants, and urban workers. Some rural communities were self-governing and had no ties to larger political entities, while others were connected to broader power structures. There were big differences in how these communities were integrated into the Visigothic kingdom, and this variation would continue throughout the early Middle Ages. That's why historian Iñaki Martín Viso talks about islands of authority, as Visigothic rule wasn't uniform across the peninsula. With the collapse of Roman imperial authority, the process of wealth concentration that had started in the late empire was disrupted in some areas. But in places like Toledo, the Guadalquivir Valley, and the Ebro Valley, powerful landowners and a growing church continued to dominate. As a result, Visigothic society was based on patronage and dependency relationships between lords, serfs, and slaves. However, regional differences were significant, and in some areas, social elites either disappeared or became impoverished. Some scholars argue that Visigothic society was dominated by slaves, but this idea seems exaggerated. Most of the population had a servile legal status, meaning they weren't fully free, but not strictly slaves either. These serfs were peasants who couldn't be bought or sold, nor could they be separated from the land they worked. Serfs and land leaseholders were in a similar situation, and among them they enjoyed relative equality, with subtle forms of inequality only being displayed in adornments and burials. Peasant communities had some internal autonomy, often resolving minor disputes among themselves in assemblies without the involvement of their lords. There were all types of serfs. Some were serfs of the king or the treasury, which gave them higher status. Many were serfs of the church, working on lands owned by bishoprics and monasteries. Others were domestic serfs, who lived with their masters, and the majority were rural serfs, who worked on the fields of landowners. Serfdom was hereditary. They paid rent to their lords and couldn't leave the land they farmed. If needed, they were also required to serve as soldiers. Serfs had very few rights, and since they had to obey, if their lords, for instance, rebelled against the king, they couldn't be punished as they were simply following orders. So the lord-serf relationship was very unequal, although there were some reciprocal obligations.
The verdict.
In today's verdict, I want to ask you some questions about Justinian's Renovatio Imperii. Do you think restoring the Roman Empire was possible? Imagine you are in the 6th century and history hasn't played out yet. What decisions do you think could have led to a complete reconquest of the Roman West? And regarding Byzantine Spania, do you think Justinian really aimed to conquer the entire Visigothic kingdom? Or did he have other motives? Could he have won over the Hispano-Roman landowners? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comment section on this video or podcast. And with that, the verdict ends. That said, remember to subscribe to the YouTube channel and podcast New History of Spain. And if you like my content, share it with fellow history enthusiasts. Join my Discord and consider becoming a supporter on Patreon or a paid subscriber on Apple Podcast for exclusive benefits. Links are in the description. In the next episode, I will discuss how the Visigothic Kingdom of Toledo was built under its most significant monarch, Suebi. Thanks for listening and see you soon!